In the autumn of 2020, one of the world's last remaining fully operational World War II Catalina flying boats was making a morale-boosting appearance in Scotland.
The Catalina is a fantastically strong aeroplane, the most successful flying boat ever built. More than 3,000 were built, more Catalinas than all other flying boats put together.
She landed on Loch Ness, close to RAF Alness, where the type was stationed in World War II. From here, the Catalinas of Coastal Command extended Britain's wartime reach into the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The visit proved to be the perfect fill-up for the hard-pressed local tourism industry.
I think apart from Nessie herself, then it's probably the strangest thing that we've seen on the Loch. It's very unusual.
The Catalina, originally designed as a pure flying boat in the 1930s, was almost obsolete before the war even began. However, she quickly found a home as a versatile, if slow, hunter-bomber, operating against submarines and surface craft. However, she was best known for her wartime air-sea rescue role, the huge rear observation blisters hinging open to drag in downed airmen.
In the wartime days, some of those pilots were flying this plane with a remarkably low number of hours, 50 hours, 100 hours. When I think about that, it's ridiculous what was being demanded of those guys.
What should have literally been a flying visit for the modern Catalina turned into a dramatic battle to save one of the world's rarest aircraft.
And we just stopped to let a cameraman off the aeroplane. We started engines again, but unfortunately the right engine said not starting.
I've seen Loch Ness when the waves are crashing around the shores and the plane's not built for that.
Its operators are now facing a race against time to escape from Loch Ness.
What is this super plane? Anything familiar? That torso with a middle-aged sag? Her speed less than some cars can do. Maneuverable? Some days all right. On others she brings around like a 10-ton truck.
Just like the 80-year-old example that landed on Loch Ness, the original wartime Miss Pickup was built by Canadian Vickers at Cartierville. In due course, this Catalina found its way to the United Kingdom, where it went into action providing air-sea rescue cover for the United States Army Air Force base at Halesworth in Suffolk.
The same procedure is followed with the Catalinas. As they take off, control at air-sea rescue is notified in the same manner, and the airborne time is again posted.
So it was that Miss Pickup was operating over the North Sea on March the 30th, 1945, on a mission that was to prove its last of the war. The aircraft was sent to the aid of a fighter pilot downed off a Dutch island in the North Sea. Escorted by two P-51 Mustangs, she landed to begin the rescue. However, as the captain, Second Lieutenant John V. Lapinas, attempted to turn the plane on the water, the crew discovered a now familiar problem. Her right engine failed to start. An oil line had been severed. Miss Pickup was now herself in need of rescue. But worse was to come. During the next day, she was attacked by a pair of Me-262s, the Luftwaffe's new jet fighter, tearing off the tail and peppering the fuselage with holes. The crew abandoned her. Enemy raiders returned in an effort to finish her off, a sitting duck in the North Sea. And on March the 31st, 1945, she sank. That, though, was just the beginning of their troubles. Despite repeated attempts to drop full-size rescue boats for them, the crew were adrift in desperate conditions for 4 days. Finally getting a lifeboat dropped to them, the stranded crew battled 10-foot seas, more enemy fire, and the failure of the lifeboat's engines, before eventually being picked up by an RAF rescue launch on the evening of April the 4th and taken to Great Yarmouth. 75 years later, and the current Catalina, bearing the same name as her illustrious forebear, Miss Pickup, has successfully landed on Loch Ness, and thankfully appears to be in good seaworthy condition. But her pilot, Paul Warren Wilson, is acutely aware of her limitations and briefs his team accordingly.
This aeroplane wants to fly. She wants to go on the water. She's at home in the water. She's beautifully built, fantastically designed, excellent hull for carving through the water, even when it's rough. But you have to have a feeling for the plane, which only comes gradually. I mean, the Catalina is a fantastically strong aeroplane, the most successful flying boat ever built. More than 3,000 were built, more Catalinas than all other flying boats put together at that stage.
Like so many warbirds, the aircraft currently flying as Miss Pickup is not the original airframe. She's painted to represent a PBY-A Catalina that operated for the United States Army Air Force in the UK during World War II. The aircraft is, though, of wartime vintage, built in Canada. The current Miss Pickup was originally ordered for the Royal Canadian Air Force, delivered on the 27th of October 1943, and initially saw service at Bella Bella on the British Columbia coast. The Canadian Catalina, known as the Kansas, were mainly operated from water despite their amphibious undercarriages, and were used on day and night patrol searching for enemy submarines. When the war ended, it ended a period of storage before being converted to a freighter in 1948. It was finally struck off military service in 1961 and became a firefighting water bomber with well-known Catalina operator Kentings. In 1980, she was part of the Norcon Air waterbombing fleet taken over by the province of Saskatchewan to protect their northern forests. By the late 1990s, the remaining Saskatchewan Catalinas were sent to East Africa and converted to passenger aircraft for the tourist industry in Zimbabwe. That deal, though, fell through, and in 2004, the official Catalina Society plain sailing swooped in to buy the aircraft, then civilian registered as C-FNJF, to put her to work as a tourism and historic attraction on the global airshow circuit. But there was a whole host of upgrades and jobs to be done on her before she would be sufficiently airworthy and seaworthy to be flown from Canada back to the UK. The owners dispatched engineer Gary Shaw to work on the aircraft with a small team of volunteers. More conversion work, safety and performance modifications were undertaken. The race was on to get her into the air and back to the UK before any more air shows were missed. After detailed inspections by the local aviation authorities, she was given the paperwork needed, a limited supplemental type certificate, and permission to fly.
03-179.
What does that mean?
We've got an LSTC at last.
God, let me be the first to congratulate you.
Why, thank you very much, sir.
Even on the day of departure, things didn't go smoothly. The weather was awful, and the flight, already abandoned once due to high winds, looked at risk. Even the vehicle moving the plane suffered setbacks.
Well, a tractor does it. It wouldn't move it the other day. It had so much water in the bilges.
However, Gary Short and his team were rewarded for long weeks in Canada preparing her for the ferry flight to Ireland, arriving on the 30th of March after nearly 13 hours in the air and in temperatures as low as minus 28 degrees. After her triumphant arrival at Duxford, she flew the airshow circuit for a year in her now rather faded yellow paint, before a winter transformation to her new United States Army Air Force colours, depicting a Catalina number 44-33915 of the 8th Air Force 5th Emergency Rescue Squadron. In those markings she's flown ever since, memorialising the original aircraft and crew and all those who served on the iconic Catalina.
In the wartime days, some of those pilots were flying this plane with a remarkably low number of hours, 50 hours, 100 hours. When I think about that, it's ridiculous what was being demanded of those guys. So usually when I'm flying the plane, I'm totally focused on just flying the plane. But any time that we stand back and think about what those people achieved, what those pilots and crew achieved during the war, it's staggering.
Paul Warren Wilson started his flying career as a cadet, quickly moving on to the RAF's basic jet trainer, the Jet Provost, then the Hawk Fast Trainer, finally converting to the Harrier GR3 based in Germany at the very height of Cold War tensions. His time with the complex and technically demanding jump jet left him in great demand as a warbird pilot after his RAF service. He co-founded the Fighter Meet Airshow series and eventually teamed up with a couple of colleagues to acquire and operate larger warbirds, eventually specialising in Catalinas. Not a cheap undertaking.
Funding is always a concern for the Catalina. We run with a group of 25 shareholders who pay monthly fees, and thanks to their capital input for a share and their monthly fees, we're able to meet our running costs. So it's not a case of it's a rich man's toy, it's something which eats money. It really does.
Catalinas are in great demand for filming and promotional work, and it's this which, in the autumn of 2020, brought Paul and the team and the wonderful Miss Pickup to Loch Ness. Paul and the team had been engaged to deposit a pair of sporting celebrities onto the waters of Loch Ness as part of filming for a television panel show. The contestants leaving the aircraft and swimming to shore. All had gone well in perfect weather conditions and on a still loch. The TV crew were happy with their results and departed Miss Pickup, leaving her to simply restart her engines, taxi across the loch and head for home.
The guys shut the aeroplane down to let people off, I believe, and then come to restart it, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. The starter turned, but the engine didn't. So they knew they had a problem. Couldn't start one engine, couldn't take off on one engine.
We were thinking to ourselves, what on earth are they going to do? Where are they going to put it? I've seen Loch Ness when the waves are crashing around the shores, and the plane's not built for that.
Loch Ness is, 30 kilometres long or more, and a couple of kilometres wide. So it's a big piece of water, and if the wind is free to blow along that for any stretch of time, the waves are going to get up and can be really significant.
It's quite flimsy, actually, so any big waves or wind will end up destroying it after a while. So it's imperative that you get the aircraft to safety, and safety being out of the water.
She's not indestructible, and we needed help. There are big winds coming. There are threats to the aeroplane. Exposed to the elements for months and months, she's going to deteriorate significantly.
Then it's just total disaster. One reasonably large hole in the hull, and it's just unthinkable.
The race was on to save one of the last Catalinas from a watery grave. Loch Ness may be a pool of calm and an ideal venue for an autumn day out, but in the late months of 2020, a rare Catalina flying boat was stranded on her waters, an engine broken. If she wasn't lifted to safety soon, she could join the hundreds of years of wrecks at the bottom of one of the world's deepest and most notorious inland waterways. For Paul Warren Wilson and his team, who have invested hundreds of thousands of pounds in Miss Pickup, came the realisation that their precious Catalina flying boat was in real and present danger.
People think it's a lake, a loch, it's small, it's relatively benign. It's 23 miles long, so it's longer than some of the channel crossings. So we get a huge wind fetch, the prevailing wind coming up from the southwest. So it can be like it is today, absolutely beautiful, flat calm. Particularly comes up very quick with the wind, and you can have up to 2 meters is pretty regular in the winter or in particularly windy conditions, and it's very short swell as well, so it's quite harsh if you're out in the water.
You can get waves 3.5 meters high, and they're very short and very steep, so it's a vicious old loch. That's why there's a rescue service on it. The water, it's actually classed as category C, so it can get wild at the sea level. It's just a sea categorization, so it's anything but a mill pond.
It could have foundered on the shore, there's no doubt about that. I mean, as you say, this loch can get quite rough, and with the wind blowing through the glen in which the loch is based, it could mean that anything that was immobile on the surface would be at the mercy of the wind and the current.
The problem is that also that the sides of the loch are very rocky. We don't have nice sandy beaches. We've got this one bay, Urquhart Bay, which gives very good shelter from the southwesterly wind, not so good from the northeast, because just as we have a prevailing southwesterly wind, the only other wind we have of any substance is actually a northeasterly blowing the other way, and that can be quite nasty.
When we did our work on the water, when we stopped on the water, it was nearly calm wind and just beautiful little choppy waves of about 3 inches maximum. So no problem at all in the short term. But in the longer term, because we knew it would take some time to fix the problem, whatever it was, in the longer term we need shelter, we need to get to a buoy, and then if it's going to be a long time, we need to find a way to protect the plane more than just being moored to a buoy. And we needed help, and fortunately we were quite near to the local RNLI station. They got their kit on, came out and lent a hand, which made a huge difference to us.
Any craft out in the loch, it's the most common way to get caught out is with the weather coming up very quickly, and the shoreline, the water's very dark, you can't see the shore the same as you would in the sea for most parts. Very random, the rocks, so you get anywhere near the shore at all in any kind of wave and it will just put holes straight in whatever goes on it.
When it was out there was a fair old wind blowing there. It would have been driven down onto the shore at doors. It's possible there they could have put the wheels down and it would have, but there's some pretty big cobbles down there.
Despite the fact that the RNLI were on the scene and assisting, a new problem emerged. Night was falling, making operations even more hazardous. And before she could be towed to the loch side, it was vital to get the passengers safely ashore.
Are you looking down there?
Yeah.
I'll get the pole.
Right, let him go there. Yeah, I'll grab you. I'll tell you when. Right, go down there.
On Loch Ness, Miss Pickup had spent the night temporarily moored to a buoy. However, it was vital the aged aircraft is lifted to the safety of dry land as soon as possible. Not only was this logistically difficult, but also cripplingly expensive, prompting a public appeal.
Hello, my name is Matt Dillon. I'm one of the volunteer pilots for our beloved Catalina Miss Pickup. It's only now that we've started this operation that we've got a better idea of the true costs involved in this, and hence we've taken the decision to increase our funding target to just over £29,000. This should cover the cost of the entire operation from getting her off the loch and back home to her nice warm hangar in Duxford before the winter sets in.
One of our members started a GoFundMe campaign which was amazingly successful and has brought us £30,000, which has covered the costs of craning out of the water, 6 weeks of work here, accommodation, tools, transport. Fortunately, just 800 metres away on the other side of Urquhart Bay is Temple Pier, where they very kindly allowed us to bring the plane out of the water onto the land and put the aircraft in a much more controlled situation where in slow time we could tie her down properly, put scaffolding around, put some weather protection, bring in cranes and so on, and get on with the job of changing the engine.
The rescue was planned. However, there was a hitch. The Catalina is fitted with special lifting points on the top of her wing, but these are designed for use in the hangar with overhead hoists. At the loch side, the team had to improvise, and a large and powerful crane would be needed at considerable expense to hoist her out of the water.
I was astonished to hear that they could be operational for up to 14 hours in the air. That's quite extraordinary, it seemed to me. And clearly they required a huge fuel capacity to do that. And you were telling me that the fuel is, the tanks are housed in that wing up on the top. I can just imagine the kind of weight that these two engines are required to lift out of the water.
The worry of craning her out by her massive wing has to be weighed against the risk of leaving her where she is. The fear was that, had she been left on the loch, she could take on water and sink. While she is fully capable and licensed for water operations, she's not sealed in quite the same way as wartime aircraft, and without bilge pumps running and in rough water, she could have been swamped. If she were to have more trouble getting off Loch Ness, the prognosis could be grim, and she wouldn't be the first aviation wreck on the bottom.
In 1976, Marty Klein brought his side scan sonar here, and when they returned to America, they found on the sonar traces the image of an aeroplane. And initially they thought it was a Catalina. You can see the two engines there, and you can see why they might have thought that. But subsequently, Robin Holmes of Heriot-Watt University identified the wreck as a Wellington bomber in 70 metres of water in Loch Ness, and ultimately successfully salvaged the wreck in 1985, and it's now at the Spirit of Brooklands Museum in Weybridge.
The Catalina team were well aware of the Wellington wreck and nervously watched the crane get to work.
It was 150 tonner, a big beast. The wheels go in all directions, fascinating watching it. So they put it in there, got it all set up with all the extra weights and all the rest of it. The reason it was so big is to get the jib length to get out to be able to lift the thing at that distance. Because they had to be far enough back so that when they lifted it, they could actually put it on the end of the pier. I was on one of the ropes on the end, trying to take pictures and watch it as well. And we were very lucky. The weather was virtually flat calm. Lifted it up perfectly. Beautifully done.
As the crew finally managed to get to the faulty engine on dry land, it was very evident that this wouldn't be an easy job. 1 month after Miss Pickup arrived on Loch Ness, Paul, Gary and the team will finally find out tomorrow whether they have a chance of flying the Catalina out in one piece. Even the few days that she'd been fully exposed to the elements on Loch Ness had taken their toll. Lubricants had been washed out of hard-to-reach hinges and panels, and the rain, even though light, had penetrated many compartments. In wartime, a team of dozens of engineers would take this in their stride, with access to unlimited spares and with no regard for cost. Gary and his small team at Loch Ness didn't have any such luxury, and were in a race against time. Further inspection of the engine that had failed revealed it had to come off the aircraft.
As you can see, this part of the engine is everything from the firewall forward is a engine change unit. Well, we don't have one of those. We have a bare engine, which is literally that, just the bare bones of the engine, which we have to put everything from this engine that's serviceable onto before we can put it back on. And that should take us a few days with the following wind.
So having lifted the whole aircraft out of the loch, the team now had to take the engine off with the utmost care to be able to transfer the parts across to the new unit.
Because if everyone starts waving and shouting, he doesn't know who to listen to or to act on. And then the next thing, we've incident or accident, and that's what we don't want. So if you want it stopped, just tell me and I'll stop.
The engine was finally removed to be replaced with the new unit. Another massive physical and logistical challenge for the team.
We baby them really, but in those days they just had to punish them. It's a punishing situation. Extreme weights, long distances, cold, hot, everything like that. So these engines were, I think they made more of these than any other aero engine, especially radials.
Every single thing has to be checked, every single panel that goes on, every single screw, nut, bolt, because if something comes loose, it can endanger the engine.
Well, we've stripped down most of the accessories and tin work, the covers, etc. off the engine. Now we're just putting some of them onto the new one while we can. Tomorrow, a guy from Stoddart will come along and swap these engines over on their stands, because that one's better for building up. This one's not quite good enough for that. So the Duff one, well, we think it's Duff, is going to go on this shipping stand, and this one's going to go on the build-up stand, ready to be put back on next week. Starter motor will go on here, the generator below it, fuel pump will go under here, vacuum pump underneath, and tacho Jenny, which goes on the rev counter here, that will go on this bit, and then the big bit, the carburetor, goes on top of this pad here. Well, not on top of it, the pad comes off, it goes on here. Personally, and the guys helping me, I think we'll have this Dutchwood back on the wing and possibly running by, where are we now, Wednesday? Sometime middle of next week to the end of next week.
Despite worsening weather and logistical problems, Gary and Roger got the components built onto the new engine core and bench tested what they could. The only way they could test all the systems, though, was to winch the engine back onto the aircraft. Morale was raised as the crane team returned for this operation. Evening was drawing in at Loch Ness. The engine was fitted, oil and hydraulics topped up, and she was covered for the night. The next day was the most critical so far. Engine test day. 1 month after being stranded at Loch Ness, this stricken part of aviation history, one of the world's last fully operational World War II flying boats, had been lovingly repaired by her dedicated crew in the hope they can finally fly her out and home to Duxford. An entire engine has had to be removed and some of its key components integrated into a new unit before being winched back onto the aircraft for testing.
Everything on here is hard work. This is just extra hard work because of the place that we're at. This is the final part. The engine will be oiled up. Fingers crossed. You'll hear pretty sounds. You've got to be very quick because that the big thing out there is a real pain all the time. So you never know what's going to happen.
Perhaps the most famous Catalina lost on an inland waterway isn't sitting at the bottom of a lake. In fact, it's been on public display for 60 years and is slowly rotting away, leaving behind only its extraordinary story.
Well, I'm quite amazed it's lasted as long as it has. When you consider, where it is, and you couldn't kind of imagine a worse place to leave something like this. And here it is stuck on the beach, and it hasn't disappeared altogether, And the blue's underneath.
The blue underneath there.
The navy underneath.
Wow.
Like many Catalinas after the war, the now sad wreck beached near Sharm el-Sheikh in the Middle East was once a magnificent passenger aircraft. Its tale, though, is curious. Owned by millionaire Thomas Kendall, the aircraft had been in Britain filming the B-movie SOS Pacific. When filming wrapped, Kendall undertook a round-the-world holiday with family and friends on the luxurious air yacht. They were greeted like royalty wherever they went, until on Wednesday the 23rd of March 1960, they set down in an inviting-looking inlet, unnamed on their map, which the pilots thought was in Egypt. Unfortunately, they'd landed in a sensitive area of Saudi Arabia, and local tribesmen fearing an invasion opened fire on the unprotected aircraft, injuring Kendall and members of his party and damaging, like Miss Pickup, the right engine. The Kendall party found themselves under house arrest at the tribe's camp while an international incident unfolded. Eventually they were freed, and after medical treatment all survived. However, the USA refused to supply spare parts for the aircraft, fearing it may be pressed into military use, and sadly, the once magnificent air yacht was left to rot on the receding sea line, where a now vandalised and dissected skeleton remains to this day. She's a stark reminder that the same fate might have, and still could, await Miss Pickup. Far from the sunshine of the Middle East, it was cold and damp at Loch Ness. Alone in the cockpit, the pressure was on for engineer Gary Short as he silently ran through his final pre-start checklist for the new engine. If everything was in order, she would start. If not, it would have meant engine removal and back to the workshop. The tension was palpable as the engine rotated on its starter.
Well done. Really, really well done, mate.
For Miss Pickup, it looked like the risk of not escaping, spending a winter or worse trapped on Loch Ness, was finally receding. Now perhaps she could start her journey home. With the engine runs completed, all had looked well for a getaway. However, for the first time, the loch began to strike back. Winds and rain increased towards the projected return to flight day, and it was aborted. The following weekend had a weather window, but with snow threatened, that too slipped. One final attempt was scheduled for the start of December before a projected 3 weeks of severe weather. The team knew when the day began cold but still and clear that it was now or never. In the early morning darkness at the side of Loch Ness, the meticulous planning by the Catalina rescue team was coming into its own. The now familiar crane crew arrived to lift her back onto the water, carefully positioning their equipment ready for the instructions of the crew. Electrical and system tests were undertaken, and Paul held a final briefing.
As you know, the problem with putting the plane on the water is wind blowing us into something. Hopefully there won't be too much wind. To cope with that, what we will do, as I see the sequence, is we've got a line attached to each of the floats, just as we had last time, although I wasn't here then. And looking after those lines will be Gary on the starboard float and Roger on the port float. And the aim of those lines is just to keep the plane facing directly towards the quay.
If the engine started and the aircraft flew, the plan was an initial flight to the West Midlands, then a short hop the next day to arrive at Duxford as the airfield reopened. The final engine checks were complete. The aircraft had been made safe and was ready for the water. The whole winching operation was undertaken slowly and with great care, and it made for a fascinating time lapse, condensing the 20-minute operation into one simple move.
Belts and pedals set.
Seats, belts, pedals set. For now.
Parking brake off.
Pilots Paul Warren Wilson and Matt Dearden now have the aircraft prepared and go through their pre-flight checklist before the critical power checks and takeoff run.
Set.
Pitch fully fine.
Fully fine.
Mixtures ICO.
ICO.
Cowgirls open.
Open.
Carb heat cold.
Cold.
Static manifold pressure note.
Noted.
Radio master switch as required.
Not required.
Start clearance as required.
Not required.
Rotating beacon on.
Not required.
Ignition master on.
On.
Restart's complete.
Check. Thanks, man. We're ready to fire up. Battery on. Turn and go. Hatches overhead. Let's do that now. Actually, want to think about it.
Despite the good weather, everything had to work perfectly and the swell on the loch raised some concern. As when the aircraft is travelling at 90 miles an hour in our takeoff run, any mistake or technical issue can quickly become a crisis. Finally though, as maximum takeoff power was applied, the Catalina broke free from the water that had held her captive as the threat of winter drew in, and she climbed out over the dark, forbidding surface of the loch. After 6 long weeks she's in the air, passing over the assembled crowd of well-wishers on the side of Loch Ness, and tipping her wings in the long-established gesture of thanks from all warbirds. After 6 weeks stranded at Loch Ness, in which her dedicated crew had to battle to save her, one of the world's last Catalina flying boats is now safely airborne once more, and on the first part of her homeward journey to Duxford. Her first flight of freedom was short though, a 12-mile hop to Inverness Airport to do a systems check, ensure that all was working well, and most importantly take on the fuel for the 500-mile journey to Cambridgeshire via the Midlands.
Went to plan really, as smooth as we can expect. A little bit wavier than we anticipated out there. Quite a few. I'm glad I got my window closed about a second before a bloody great wave came over the top. But otherwise, no, she's all good. She's behaving. Inverness now. Just going to refuel her, and then head south, back home. We'll get her home now, back in a nice hangar, and tuck her away for the winter, basically.
At Duxford, the long, anxious wait was almost over, as finally the ground team's beloved Catalina came into view. Mission accomplished. Safe on the ground, the new engine had performed flawlessly and she was prepared for her first night in a hangar in 3 months.
Beginning of December right now, it's cold, wintry, it's about 3 degrees today. You know, the weather could have been really against us, but we were just so lucky. It's just, well, not blue skies, but as good as you're going to ask for, really. The plane's been behaving herself, new engine, pretty faultless, really. Testament to the team and, you know, and everybody who's worked on it. It's just been fantastic, really. We're happy to be home.
As soon as the cat's home, she's groomed for the next prowl. That's a blitz buggy towing her into position for overhaul. Some job for a maintenance officer keeping an aerial antique acting like a dive bomber. The bad symptoms sheet. Port propeller throwing oil. Nothing serious, but a new part is needed. These cats take plenty. Some here are nearly 4 years old.
As the current Miss Pickup enters her 8th decade of continuous operation, is testament to the incredible efforts of her crew and the original design, that an aircraft regarded in wartime as worn out in less than 5 years continues to fly and perform at air shows.
With the crane there lifting her back onto the water, that was sort of the tricky bit that we were all a little nervous about. It's not something we do very much, and we know we needed light winds, which in winter in Scotland that's not exactly very common, particularly on Loch Ness. Textbook operation, really. The waves were quite interesting on Loch Ness. That was that caught us out a little bit. We weren't quite anticipating them to be as big as that, but you know, she's designed for much bigger waves than that, so it's just something a bit new for us. For this season, that's mission accomplished, and yeah, she'll go back into the hangar now and undergo the usual winter maintenance, ready for next year, basically.
In the preceding 44 days, the Catalina Miss Pickup, one of the world's rarest flying aircraft, had faced an uncertain future. Dogged by technical issues and stranded on an unforgiving loch in deteriorating conditions. The determination and perseverance of a dedicated team and the support of the public, however, means she lives to fly another day, to honour those who operated in and were helped by the Catalina flying boat, and in this case, rescued in an escape from Loch Ness.